The Elder Scrolls universe is one that's constantly changing. Change, which ultimately ends up creating not only the plot of the games, but also tends to be the motivation or end result of various events throughout its history and its greatest characters. Some of those characters, however, manage to not only transcend their counterparts in memorability, but more specifically in what they become. This, of course, being in reference to the topic of today's video, the gods. A topic that we'll be dived deeper into throughout this video, revealing not only what this last group of gods is, but what they mean for the games to come, and maybe more. To start off, like I've said and will continue to say many times over, this video is very much based in the canon and henceforth the context of the Elder Scrolls universe, with the primary sources of the lore presented in these videos being lore books, the games, with some leeway for various developer decisions, and any other form of licensed Bethesda work. The exception being that the larger consensus of the lore community is always kept in mind while various topics are compiled for these videos. But with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get right into the video. Like I've come to explain with previous videos, this particular 3-part series, of which this video will be the last, is on the gods of Tamriel, with the term god, at least in the series, constituting some at Ada, Aedra, or just mortals who've managed to transcend their physical bonds, with some exceptions. In the case of this video, I'll be focusing on the latter end of that sentence. That being that I'll be doing a brief overview of the various mortals who ascended to godhood, be it through legitimate means or just in the hearts of their followers. With the previous video having had covered the less accepted gods, and the first of this series having had covered the more widely accepted ones. That said, I will refrain from covering any Daedric princes, for obvious reasons, or any of the false gods of the Tribunal, including Dagoth, as those 4 have quite a bit of history around them, and simply covering them in this video would be a disservice to the characters. To start us off, the Ascended Gods, as I'll refer to them from now on, number a total of 8, with those 8 being Diagna, Nerevar, Reman Cyrodiil, Morehouse, Cuhlecain, Talos, Mannimarco, and Rajhin, with a few exceptions to the coverage of this video, such as Talos, Mannimarco, and Nerevar, being established a few seconds ago. Though that doesn't mean I won't cover those exceptions in more detail later on. The first of the gods that was mentioned on the list, and perhaps the one we know the least about on in said list, is Diagna, or Calc god of the Sideways Blade. Diagna is said to have been an avatar of the Ykuden, otherwise known as Redguard god Hunding, that somehow managed to achieve permanence. As to how Diagna even became the avatar of a god in the first place is not well known. What is well known, though, is how Diagna was not the only avatar to appear at the time, the warrior Hunding being one as well, with the 2 avatars being instrumental in defeating the invasion of the left-handed elves in the First Era, where Diagna is most keenly attributed with bringing orichalc weapons to the Ykudens, hence winning them the fight. As to how his legacy has since changed, originally Diagna had a tightly knit group of followers known as the Order of Diagna, with their most well-known triumph or mission being the campaign they led against the Orcs of Orsinium. Sadly, after this event occurred, Diagna would fade into obscurity, becoming nothing more than a local power spirit of the Dragontail Mountains. As to his status as a god, it's not known as to whether his permanence has since faded, but that may as well be a potential answer. The next god on the list is none other than the ancient Chimeri or Dunmeri warlord Indoril Nerevar. Now to be brief, Nerevar, also known as Moon and Star and Godkiller, was the Chimeri king of Resdayn, which would become Morrowind. As the Hortator or leader of the great houses of Morrowind, he managed to unite the then Chimer people, creating a pact with the Dwemer in the process, who would also be the founder of what would become the First Council, essentially being that previously mentioned alliance of the Dwemer and Chimer elves, creating a brief time of peace amongst not only the Chimer, but their deep elf counterparts. Though, as I said, this alliance did not last long, as Vorin Dagoth, one of Nerevar's closest friends, would come to learn of the Dwemeri tonal architect Kagranak's plans to use the Heart of Lorkhan to help their brethren ascend. Something that when Nerevar learned of, he, alongside many other Chimer, saw as blasphemy, and upon confronting his friend Dumak, the Dwarf King, resulted in the degradation of the two's relationship, ultimately destroying the alliance and resulting in the War of the First Council. It would also be during this war that many things critical to not only the plot of The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind would happen, but also things that would change the fate of many races, and more so gods, though I'll get to that a bit later. As to what happened to Indoril Nerevar, it seems, at least from the various accounts we have, however accurate they may be, that the Dwemer suddenly disappeared, and the heart was ultimately left in the hands of the Chimer. Though this would once again be a brief respite, and as the plot of Morrowind goes, Vorin Dagoth would become corrupted by the fragment of the god, ending with him not only supposedly killing his friend Nerevar, but also unfolding the events that would lead to the rise of the false gods. From here, the remaining closest people to Nerevar, those being Vivec, Almalexia, and Sothasil, would use the power of the heart, despite the heretical behavior that it was, and ascend to godhood. Though, like I said earlier, their story is far too complex to discuss at this time. It would also be here that they, in an attempt to legitimize their rule, would crown Nerevar as the herald of the Triune Ways, making the former Hortator of the Chimer, now Dunmer people, the avenue from which they would grow their new religion, and Tribunal Temple as they would call it. Though it should be noted that this godhood, or rather sainthood that was granted to the late Nerevar, would not be comparable to that of a god like Talos, as it seems that it was almost completely a name and not truly power, though simply because of its world-changing effects I've put it on this list. That said, Nerevar's death would lead to a split in the great houses of Morrowind, ending with the Ashlander tribes separating themselves from the blasphemous tribunal worshippers, where the Ashlanders would begin worshipping the reincarnation of their great leader, known as the Nerevarine, as a god, and more so, as Morrowind's savior from the corruption that was the false gods. All of which would spearhead the plot of The Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, ending with the defeat of Dagoth III and supposed ascension of the hero to either godlike or pseudo-godlike status, though that bit is heavily argued. Whatever the result may have been, just like with Indoril Nerevar, the Nerevarine was critical to shaping modern-day Tamriel, and despite his story ending with a mission to Akavir, is still felt in every story told since, which is why the Nerevarine, and as mentioned before, Indoril Nerevar, were put on this list. The third god on this list, and one that we know to have truly achieved godhood, though not exactly how, is the Emperor Reman Cyrodiil I. Reman Cyrodiil is known most commonly as the Worldly God, most likely because of his mortal nature before Ascension. That being that before becoming the Worldly God of the Second Empire, Reman was the founder of the Reman Empire in Cyrodiil, and a great war hero from the Akaviri trouble of the First Era. It should also be noted that Cyrodiil was not in fact named after Reman, but rather was a name he took on from the Ayleid word for the region, Cyrod, as more of a political statement. As to how Reman even ended up in the position of god, it all mirrors a lot of how Indoril Nerevar came to a similar point, without all of the betrayal and giant mushrooms, of course. That being that, thanks to the Akaviri invasion, he was able to unite the various factions of men in Cyrod, and other regions like Skyrim, ultimately culminating in his crowning as emperor, and a series of events that would allow for him to rise to godhood during and after death as a symbol of the Empire of Man. In addition, there's also quite a few tales surrounding Reman, specifically after his death, made most likely to attempt to legitimize his rule, those being him essentially being the product of the union between King Hral and the spirit of Saint Alessia, with him having been found by a shepherdess at Sankar, the place he was supposedly born, and carried to the Ruby Throne with the Amulet of Kings embedded in his forehead. And of course the screaming of the future Emperor's name by none other than Pelinal Whitestrake almost 25 years before his birth. Though, like mentioned previously, while corroborated heavily, most of these stories may have been but a way to legitimize not only his rise to godhood, but his legitimacy as the Emperor. The next god, then, is one from a similar region, but also one before the time of Reman Cyrodiil, that being the supposed winged man-bull Morhaus. Now, Morhaus is already confirmed to have been a demigod within his own life, with items like the Lord's Mail being fabled to have belonged to him. Though where Reman became a god mostly from the people, Morhaus is quite the opposite. As for him, it's stated and even hinted many times that he, similar to his good friend Pelinal, was capable of using tonal magics, specifically in the form of the Thu'um. He's also, as stated before, confirmed to have essentially been a Minotaur, and for that reason, the reason why Minotaurs exist in Tamriel altogether. Though perhaps the strangest part of this tale is Morehouse's title as the lover of Saint Alessia, where it's told many times over that he was the consort of the saint. As to what exactly Morehouse may have been, though, that's still up for debate, but as it currently stands, according to a conversation that Pelinal Whitestrake is said to have had with Morehouse, whom he considered like a nephew, concerning his romance with Alessia, Pelinal and Morehouse were Ada, essentially reiterating their demigod and perhaps immortal status to us. As for how this legendary warrior became a true god is something that's more so down to the people of the region making him as such, though unlike Reman, Morehouse's death is unknown, ultimately leaving him in great mystery, and a faded form of worship in the imperial pantheon as time progressed. The god after Morehouse on our list is perhaps the most prolific of any of the gods in recent history, that of course being Talos Stormcrown, or Ysmir Wulfharth as he is known by the Nordic pantheon. Now, unlike the others on this list, I'll refrain from going too heavily into how Talos, and subsequently Ysmir, came to be. The simple reason being that the story tends to delve heavily into both non-canon works and unconfirmed sources, though I will of course still give somewhat of story. So, to begin with, the imperial representation, Talos, is said to be the mortal god of men, essentially becoming the replacement for Reman Cyrodiil after he ascended to godhood. As to how he came to be, the legend goes that once Tiber Septim had completely conquered Tamriel, and upon his death, ascended to become the ninth and youngest divine, standing as a symbol for mankind's triumph. Though, as we already know, his worship has degraded greatly as the eras have gone on, and is now but a banned god who only lives in the hearts of the people, most specifically in the Nords. Though there is a reason for this, that being that Talos was but a modern form of the god that the Nords once worshipped as Ysmir Wulfharth, with some caveats of course. This is also where the story gets quite convoluted, but in short, the Nords once had a mortal-turned-god called Ysmir Wulfharth, who through a long series of events involving other gods, the War of the First Council, and reincarnation via retroactive godhood, achieved such a title. But while I may not continue the highly convoluted story of Talos Stormcrown, and thusly Ysmir Wulfharth in this video, as it's just an overview, I have talked to some extent about it in previous videos. Specifically, the first episode of this God series with Shore, and the Talos Trichotomy video, both of which I will link. Moving on then, we have a god who's almost just as, if not more convoluted than the story that surrounds Talos. That of course being Mannimarco, King of Worms, or as he became known, God of Worms. Now to start off with Mannimarco, he began life, or at least his career as a mage, mostly after he joined the Sigic Order. While there, it would become known that, unlike his friend and fellow mage Vanis Galerian, Mannimarco was a dark and cold soul, experimenting with magics such as necromancy and other forms of immoral revival similar to it. This was eventually found out by Vanis, however, and despite his warnings, Mannimarco would continue with his forbidden practices, all of which would end with him being banished from Artaeum, the island of the Sigics. Though, as we will soon see, this was not the end of Mannimarco's story, and as time went on, he would come to presumably found the Worm Cult, with the followers of said cult essentially being those who also wished to practice the same sort of necromantic magics as Mannimarco did. Magics that would eventually lead Mannimarco, through the events of ESO's main questline, to make a deal with Molag Bal, with the purpose of said deal having been to secretly ascend to godhood by stealing it from the Daedric Prince. This did not, however, work, and Mannimarco would be captured and punished for his betrayal, though as we would come to find, like before, Mannimarco would escape his Daedric master, going on to quarrel and even war with the very guild that his former friend, Vanis Galerian, had founded, the Mages Guild to be exact, resulting in not only the death of hundreds of individuals, but the legendary sage Vanis himself. Though, from what it seemed like at the time, the battle had been successful, and Mannimarco had been defeated. But as many times before, he would return, and this time in the form of an immortal lich, a form much stronger than before, and one that could not easily be slain. It would be this reappearance that's generally accepted to have been the event to trigger the plot and surrounding threads of the story of the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, with the Necromancer, who some, though not the majority, claim to have simply been one to take Mannimarco's name, having ascended to godhood via said event, also known as the Warp in the West, with the resulting Necromancer's Moon, a celestial body that is known to eclipse Arcaes, being cited as proof of said ascendance. Though, once again, it all remains in a sort of state of limbo as to whether Mannimarco truly did ascend. In addition, it should be noted that this would not be the last time Mannimarco would reappear, and in fact the last known time, chronologically, that such a figure claiming to be him would reappear, would be during the events of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, though the being's true identity has never been properly confirmed. Nevertheless, similar to a few on this list, the God of Worms has been put on said list, surely for his power and influence throughout the eras. The second to last god, then, is a Khajiit one, specifically one that was mentioned very briefly in the previous episode of the series, that being the Khajiit thief god, Rajhin. Rajhin, otherwise known as the thief god of the Khajiit, as mentioned earlier, grew up as a mortal in the Black Kiergo section of Senchal. It would be from these humble beginnings that, thanks to the Ring of Khajiit's power, he would have become the most prolific thief to have ever come out of elsewhere, with some stories even claim that he once stole a tattoo from the neck of the Imperial Empress Kintra, as she slept. Something that, even if a tall tale, given the power of the ring, may have been true. Though this ring, according to legend, would eventually get fed up with its constant use, leaving its owner Rajhin helpless in the midst of his enemies, ultimately resulting in the brutal end of the thief. It would be after his death, however, that Rajhin would ascend to godhood, becoming the god that all Khajiit would look towards in times of desperate need, especially with things involving thievery. As for the legitimacy of his ascension, based on the events of ESO elsewhere, it can be as confirmed as we can currently get, with the spirit appearing in the game to aid the player in a long-form quest. There's also mention of Rajhin in the time of the Eternal Champion, though based off of the changing landscape of lore in the Elder Scrolls, it may not be such a great idea to pursue it. This all leads us to our last god then, Emperor Cuhlecain, otherwise known as Emperor Zero or the Petty King of Falkreath. In the case of this god, it can all be but confirmed that he did not truly ascend, as the Emperor's cult was started by none other than Tiber Septim himself, mostly in honor of his fallen comrade, who, after finally conquering the Imperial City with Tiber, would be assassinated by High Rock Nightblades. This then leads to somewhat of a conspiracy that this sudden assassination was all Tiber's doing, though that would delve somewhat into conspiracy theories rather than factual lore. Nevertheless, it all culminated in the waging of war by Tiber Septim that would create the Third Empire in Cyrodiil, and perhaps even the reason as to why Tiber Septim would ascend later in life to Talos. It should also be noted that the meticulously crafted mythos surrounding Cuhlecain had much to do with making him look to be the originator for the Empire, who Tiber simply fought in the stead of, though as mentioned earlier, all of it stinks of a politically charged stench. With that, it seems we've finally come to the end of this little series on the gods of Tamriel. Along the way, I've learned quite a few new things about the gods that I've talked about throughout my various videos on this channel, as well as being able to delve into more canonical lore in the process. And yet, the story about mortals who ascended to godhood, and even the gods, is not done yet, specifically with those such as the Tribunal, and to some extent a few talked about in this video. But a deeper dive into their stories, as well as their lore and the resulting consequences, is best left for other videos. And more so is a story for another time.
With a tweet back, walking, all my haters got the heart attack. I'm a smart boy, you know that's a fact. I'm from the top in my St. Laurent, I'm counting stacks. I'm a smart I'm a smart Tell your friends to Google me, cause I'm a smart I got pencil with me, about to teach a fashion lesson.